Welcome back to the FITSNews studios, another edition of Your Week in Review. I'm Will Folks, the founding editor of FITSNews, your host for the show. We've got a lot to cover this week. Mica Miller, this story continues to dominate headlines, to draw attention from all over the country. I'm going to sit down with our research director, Jen Wood, for the very latest on that case out of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. We're also going to talk to Jen about a big update in the Cheer Incorporated saga story this media outlet covered extensively in the aftermath of the suicide of Greenville, South Carolina cheer instructor Scott Foster almost 2 years ago. Big update in that story. I'm also going to talk with our Andy Fancher about two big criminal cases that we've been following in the South Carolina Lowcountry, some twists and turns, and an ominous warning about covering one of those cases. I'm going to walk you through all that. Last but not least, big news out of the Lowcountry involving a reality television star, Katherine Dennis of Moncks Corner, South Carolina, her latest arrest. I'm going to tell you what happened and what it could mean for her future. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. So once again, we are starting this episode with the saga of Mica Miller, which again continues to dominate headlines on our site, across South Carolina and beyond, as the interest in this case and questions about the investigation into Mica Miller's suspicious suicide just continue to persist. And I'm joined by Jen Wood, our research director, who has been on top of this case from the very beginning. Jen, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start out this segment with some discussion about what the family of Mica Miller is saying. Initially, in the aftermath of her supposed suicide, we heard some questions raised about John Paul J.P. Miller. But since then, the family has really upped the ante regarding the allegations surrounding her suspicious suicide. In fact, this week, appearing on News Nation, her father stating that the body of his daughter was placed where it was located by police, and that the crime scene, he's referring to it as, was, quote, staged. Now, Jen, I got to tell you, ordinarily we hear things like that and we think, okay, well, it's a grieving family. They're just kind of looking for answers. But in this case, as you have chronicled extensively, there are some real questions about this Robeson County Sheriff's Office investigation. Again, not impugning the integrity of those folks, certainly not at this point. We don't know enough about the investigation, but there have been some questions. Jen, first let me ask you, were you surprised to see Mica Miller's family make those statements?
You know, after going to the Lumber River State Park and, walking that path that Mica walked on her last day, I left there and I had a lot of questions. So, for them to, they had more detail about, where her body was found, where her belongings were found, and additional shell casings, apparently, they found at the scene than I did. So that just heightened heightened my feelings of something was wrong.
Yeah, there have been a ton of red flags on this case. Well, Jen, tell us a little bit about what we now know about the area where Mica Miller's belongings were found and where her body was found. It's a fairly considerable distance. Walk us through that.
So, yeah, they claimed on News Nation that her purse and belongings, which were found by a fisherman, were 40 meters away from her body. And that's a substantial distance. And where her body was found, it was down a very well-traveled trail in the park. But there's an area off of it. It's restricted access, only for park personnel. And she went down that path, and it is along the river, but where that was, it wasn't it was just stagnant. The water didn't move fast. The water, it's not like it was a flowing river, roaring. Depending on the water level, it may move quicker, but it was not quick moving water where her body was found. So
that's the basis of the theory that her body was placed where law enforcement ultimately located it, correct?
Right, because the fisherman found her purse and a separate person in the park found her body. So, I mean, obviously her purse was far enough away from her body that the fisherman who found it, didn't see her. So,
Now, Jen, we have been tracking this story obviously from the beginning. We were the first to report on the suspicious suicide of Mica Miller, but it's not just the police investigation and the conclusion of suicide that's come under scrutiny. And again, we're not saying it's wrong at this point. We're just simply saying we're open to those challenging it, especially members of Mica Miller's family. But there's also a legal battle brewing here. As we mentioned, Mica Miller had filed for divorce from her husband, Pastor J.P. Miller from the Solid Rock Church there in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She had filed for divorce, and Miller had been served with those divorce papers less than 48 hours before his wife purportedly took her own life. And there was a court hearing scheduled. Mica Miller was supposed to attend that court hearing, and that court hearing is actually still moving forward, but now Mica's family will be standing in her place at that hearing. Jen, walk us through exactly what's happening in the court system as it relates to the Mica Miller case.
so first of all, she filed for divorce. So they, in the aftermath of her death, filed petitions with probate court to appoint her sister as the special administrator of her state. And that is primarily for, I was told it was primarily for obtaining medical records, investigative reports, because despite the fact that they were separated, J.P. Miller, her husband, is technically her next of kin, meaning everything, it goes to him. So if there's any question about, the investigation, if they want to do an independent investigation, her effects from that day are going to go to him as her next of kin. So they're fighting that. They want her car that she had purchased. They want her cell phone, her purse, everything that was in that car, so that they have it. I mean,
right.
My question is, the car is still up in Robeson County. Was there a tracker on it at the time? Because there had been trackers found on it 2 previous times.
Is there any sense of whether the police checked the car to see if there was a tracker on it?
No, we have not. And we have asked those questions. We have not heard back. I think they are a small department, very overwhelmed by the attention this case is getting.
Sure. And again, obviously, folks are familiar with the Robeson County Sheriff's Office and their history. Certainly, as our Andy Fancher pointed out, there's nothing to suggest at this point anything, untoward here, but certainly questions that need to be answered, right?
Yeah, I mean, talking to investigators who are familiar with investigations into unattended deaths, the police walked into the scene following a phone call by a woman who said that she had intended to kill herself and wanted her body to be found by her family. I think they walked into the scene with the presumption that, it was what it sounded like. And that's a dangerous presumption to make. And there's a lot of movement, in various states about unattended death investigations. And I'm going to do a story on this, unattended death investigations, where there are, reports of domestic violence prior to the death, because there was no autopsy done. There was no toxicology done. And, I think in the end, that's going to be a huge problem.
No, I agree. In fact, you just pointed out the one thing that really bothers me about this case more than really anything else at this point is the fact there was no autopsy or toxicology performed in this case. And that was a decision that was solely at the discretion of the medical examiner up there in North Carolina. I just don't know how you don't perform those tests in this case, particularly knowing what they obviously knew about the fact.
Did they? We don't know that they knew. I mean,
well, fair enough.
We don't know what they knew and what questions they asked. All we have from them is the PowerPoint presentation that they released to the public and the surveillance videos that they released as response to our FOIA.
But that presentation did acknowledge that there were marital problems between J.P. Miller and Mica Miller, and clearly it doesn't take. I mean, we were able to pull a ton of records.
And a lot of states, in medical examiner protocol state that if there are potential domestic violence allegations or history of, an autopsy is automatically required in an unattended death or, death by suicide. So, I mean, I do think Mica's death is a tragedy either way it happened, but there is some potential for, looking at how things are handled in the future.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to that story you do, Jen, on the unattended deaths. What are the best practices when there have been allegations of domestic violence? And again, in this case, just a huge paper trail of questionable behavior by J.P. Miller in the months leading up to Mica Miller's death. So I don't understand how anybody looking at that trail of paper doesn't say, wait a minute, before we jump to any kind of conclusion here, let's do a full, or not even a
Right.
full inquiry. At the bare minimum, let's do an autopsy and see what happened. But Jen, there's also family history there, and our Callie Lyons did an amazing report this week. She did a couple amazing reports this week, but one in particular on J.P. Miller's father, Reginald Wayne Miller, who was a pastor during the era of Jim and Tammy Faye Baker and Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart. And walk us through a little bit of this family history, Jen.
Very quickly after, we started covering this story, we started getting tips like you absolutely need to look into federal court records and dig into the past of JP's father, who was, Reverend. He began his career in Florence and moved up to Marion, where he started the Cathedral Bible College. And in 2015, he was indicted for using international students here on visa as slave labor. And he pled guilty to those charges, and he was sentenced to time served in a federal prison. So, it was a really interesting case to read up on. Very, we have more FOIAs in to the investigative agencies who oversaw that because it was federal. It was a very interesting case and a very interesting story. He is, now a vital part of a ministry going to other countries to build, schools for people in other countries. So he's out of prison now and still practicing. And there's a lot of questions about his tactics and behavior overseas.
I also want to ask you about this component of the case. We're talking about these churches that draw these huge followings, and we're going to discuss this, I'm told, on our month in review coming up next week. But let's talk about a little bit now these churches with these followers. There's so many red flags regarding some of these churches. You had something you showed me just this morning. It was something to do with if you want to participate on the music team at J.P. Miller's church, you had to sign some form that walk us through this crazy.
Yeah, so a YouTuber who actually I've gotten to know in the process of covering this found rules for their music team at the Solid Rocket Market Common Church. And it got into four very bizarre standards. The weirdest one was must only give one armed hug, not chest to chest, when greeting the opposite sex that is married, and never text the opposite sex unless in a group with his or her spouse at church.
Wow.
Just bizarre. They request that anybody who's on the music team must be a faithful tither and a server at Solid Rock. So
let me ask you this, though. J.P. Miller, we'd obviously talked about he giving this sermon, talking about going through his wife's phone and looking at some of these text conversations. Is any of this just him trying to potentially protect himself, or what do you think the deal is with these wild regulations?
I think they're very bizarre, but I also think he, and this is based on the incident reports that Mica filed, he was trying to control every aspect of her life. And, in his sermons, you see him controlling the aspects of those following him, their lives, what they do in their marriage. And, you see a lot of people who are now speaking out about their time at the church. And, it was not a healthy situation for a lot of couples.
Absolutely not. You look at the biblical notion of a good shepherd, J.P. Miller. Not only was not that, but it certainly appears from these reports and accounts we're getting from friends of Mica Miller that in fact he was the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, she was working on a ministry in Africa. She was very devoted to it. It was, kind of, one of those things you're passionate about, and it made her light up. And he used that as a tactic to control her. It was, if you come back, you can get involved in this ministry again. Or, and when she left, well, you know, things are going great in Africa. It's too bad you can't be a part of it. And you see that in communications with them. I saw an email he sent to one of her friends he told them he's not comfortable with them speaking to her anymore unless they apologize to him. So, I mean, he was
Or repent. I think he
isolating
said they
her.
had to repent to him before they
Yes.
could. It's unbelievable.
Yes. And, those aren't things that I'm going to publish because those people are still in the same community. And they're afraid, but it does exist. And she said I could talk about it. But yeah, he asked for them to repent for talking to her about their life.
Well, Jen, I can't thank you, Callie Lyons, Andy Fancher. The three of you done amazing work on this story as we continue to try to get to the bottom of it. I want to switch gears with you now and talk about some developments in a story that also dominated headlines for months on end back in 2022. It's been very quiet over the last year or so. I'm referring to the Cheer Incorporated saga. Now, we reported back in March of this year that the feds, specifically the Homeland Security Investigations Division of the Department of Homeland Security, had detained a former coach at the Greenville, South Carolina-based Rockstar Cheer, former Rockstar Cheer, I guess it's defunct now, facility, but they detained this individual for questioning and that search warrants had been issued. And Jen, this week, news broke of a federal indictment. What is the latest on Cheer Inc., Jen?
So the coach's name is Constantine Medekas. I've spoken to a number of individuals who he coached, cheered with during his time at Rockstar, and they were all completely stunned at the news. We knew there was ongoing investigations into what was happening at that gym, but in the aftermath, it's not a name that had come up. It's not, that he was a friendly. He is a friendly guy. People are very shocked by this. And he was charged federally, I think it was May 16th, with possession and distribution of child sexual materials.
Right, child porn, basically, right? It's what they call child porn nowadays. Jen, let me ask you this. How do we know that this coach is connected to the Rockstar Cheer saga that we reported on back in August of 2022? How do we know there's a connection there?
So our sources close to the investigation said that this investigation did stem from their investigation into Scott Foster and the gym prior to Scott Foster's death by suicide. So, I did talk to a source from the U.S. Attorney's Office who has to be unnamed, and she said that there's a lot of fear in the cheer community, and they wanted to make it clear that Constantine's charges did not involve athletes that he coached at the gyms he was working. So I don't know detail beyond that, but the investigation did stem from the investigation into Rockstar Cheer and Scott Foster.
Interesting. Well, obviously the civil cases related to this saga that targeted a host of defendants, including some very influential corporate defendants, those have, for the most part, Jen, they appear to have settled.
For the most part, yeah.
That part of the saga appears to be winding down on the civil side, but obviously the criminal component of it, there's still an ongoing investigation. Is that correct?
Yes. And, there's still a coach in Tennessee that's facing criminal charges. And, even though the civil stuff may be wrapping up, it does look like the criminal is proceeding forward, which I do think is good news because people do need to be held accountable.
Well, let me ask you this question, though. One of the biggest components of the civil cases was that the industry was not doing enough to protect child athletes. And you mentioned that the federal authorities are making it clear that these charges do not necessarily involve any child athletes that this coach was involved with, but the danger is obviously there. And from your perspective, have the oversight agencies learned anything from Cheer
No,
Inc.?
no. When I was writing the article, I checked the U.S. ASF's list of banned coaches to see if Constantine was on there. He is not. He has been indicted federally for possession of child sexual materials, and he is not on their list of coaches who cannot interact with athletes.
Wow.
So if he were to go to a gym in another state and they were to check his list, he
No
wouldn't be on it.
problems.
I mean,
There'd be no problems.
right. You do hope that gyms do independent background checks on their coaches, but we've seen that in many cases they don't.
Well, Jen, just unbelievable work on this. And by the way, if you didn't follow the Cheer Incorporated saga on FITSNews.com, check it out. Just Google Cheer Inc. FITSNews. You can find it. And also don't forget to check out the Cheer Incorporated podcast. We did a dozen episodes on this story. Jen Wood, you were the driving force behind that investigation. Thank you for giving us this latest update. And let's hope that those who abuse the trust of these young athletes are held accountable for their actions. Thank you, Jen, for joining us on this, and keep us in the loop on what you hear next on this story.
I will. Thank you for having me.
A little over 2 months ago, this news outlet was inundated with tips from residents near Grays, South Carolina, who reported a massive police response at the terminus of Corner Lake Road, a boat landing on the Coosawhatchee River, which straddles the border between Jasper and Hampton counties. Now, according to these sources, an individual riding a side-by-side encountered a bound individual on the boat ramp, the banks of this river, left presumably for dead. Now, the individual who was found there, a female, yet to be identified, was not dead. And there have now been multiple arrests related to the ongoing investigation into how she ended up there, what happened to her before she ended up there. Now, we covered this story extensively in the month of April, but in the last few days, there have been some new developments in this case. 3 individuals had already previously been arrested on kidnapping charges in connection to this case, but a 4th arrest was made just this week. And I'm here with Andy Fancher. Andy, you were leading our coverage of this investigation, of this mystery on the banks of the Coosawhatchee. What happened this week in this investigation?
Well, first, to understand this arrest, we do have to go back to the 3rd of last month where this whole saga started. So, yes, FITSNews, I will give us credit. We were spearheading the reporting, the investigation into these individuals, some of whom were identified to our outlet prior to, official releasings of their names. So, yes, last I reported on it, and we dropped a big piece at the end of last month where we pretty much identify the gangs and the sets of at least one of these individuals who was arrested 1,000 miles away from Jasper. And even as I was writing that, I was scratching my head going, well, how was Jamal Terrell Riley 1,000 miles away?
Yeah, up in Indiana.
With a Kaylee Bostick, right? Which there's a whole onion we could unpeel with those two relating to prior incidents with law enforcement in the Low Country, but that's not what we're here to talk about. So now enter stage right, a 42-year-old Marquise Antoine Smith, who apparently drove Jamal and Kaylee to this airport in Augusta, and that enabled them to fly all the way to Indiana, Illinois, where they were subsequently apprehended by the U.S. Marshals. So Is he the 4th and final missing link in this very absurd saga where we've got multiple people rearing their faces amid this botched kidnapping?
So do we know at this point, we don't know who the victim is?
Well, authorities know who the victim is, and for her protection, because if you go and refer to the article that I wrote last month, where upon Jamal's own admission, he is a member of the G-Shine Bloods, and that's what he was purporting and disseminating while he was incarcerated on this prison Facebook page of his for kidnapping.
Right.
Yeah.
But she hasn't been identified publicly. And
No, and I have spoken with deputies of the Jasper County Sheriff's Office, and again, it is for their protection.
Yeah.
They're like, considering what this woman went through, to the degree that she was potentially assaulted and then left, as we have been told by multiple sources, half naked, bound at least at the hands, zip tied at that boat landing
Left
and
for
that
dead.
remote boat landing that just leads to all kinds of nature and wildlife there on the Coosawhatchee. So, I mean, unless suits are filed, I don't anticipate her going public here. That's not to say it could change, but no, I do not believe law enforcement will be releasing her name at this time.
So there's an odd sort of aura surrounding this case, kind of enveloping this case, because we cover a lot of these stories. I mean, these are stories that we have experience covering, that we deal with all the time, but there's sort of a hushed undertones in the background of this case, like, hey, even people say, hey, be careful covering this case. Is it the gang connection that's got people so worried? Because again, we, in addition to not having any positive identification yet on the victim, which obviously is preserving not only her safety, but the integrity of the investigation, we don't even know if she's speaking to law enforcement. We don't know if the leads that they're pursuing, the arrests that are being made, are from things she said or things that law enforcement has been able to come up with on their own. But Andy, in all the cases you've covered since you've gotten here, this one's a little weird, isn't it? And there's some...
Well, this one is very interesting because to Jasper County Sheriff's Office's credit, I mean, they are keeping this so uber close to the chest. And I mean, I do presume it is given the nature of these people's affiliation. I think it was very telling, very damning that Terrell would leave such a Facebook page live where he is touting his ink, touting his colors, which gives us some indication into who we're working with here. Now, the fact that they could botch a kidnapping to such a degree and subsequently expose this whole low country operation, it does make you scratch your head a little bit. But yes, at the end of the day, it appears as though we're dealing with some very serious individuals, which is why we have been advised to tread lightly.
Yeah. Well, that's not advice we're going to follow, is it?
We're
going to tread where it goes,
facts.
right? We're going to
Yes.
tread where it goes. Once again, this investigation initiated by the local sheriffs down there, but shortly thereafter, as Andy reported, became a state law enforcement division led investigation. So SLED is indeed leading this investigation. Andy, excellent work on it. I want to shift gears with you. I want to talk about an update on another big low country case that we've been following. It's a story that we reported on last week involving a triple homicide in Colleton County. And I tell you what, Colleton County folks, the Murdoch murders, the Green Pond massacre last 4th of July, now a triple homicide. Andy, walk us through the very latest on this just horrific triple homicide in Walterboro, South Carolina.
Sure, let's break it down first, the case narrative. So what we have here at about 3:30 a.m. last Saturday, May 18th, there were supposedly reports of bodies over on Hayden Street. And that, of course, prompted Colleton County Sheriff's Office to respond and subsequently find 3 bodies. Now, our sources, to their credit, they identified these individuals long before Colleton County put
Almost
out the
a week
official
ahead of
status.
time, almost.
A week ahead of time, right. So what we have here, and what has since been confirmed by the county coroner, we have Harvell Breland, 49. We've got Elisa Gardner, 43. And then we have Asira Cole, age 2. And that is what they found. That is who they found over at 105 Hayden Street on that fateful morning. Within
No one
hours-
arrested yet.
No, not to our understanding.
Okay.
Within hours of police response, there was a status update on the Colleton County Sheriff's Office Facebook page stating that this appears to be a targeted attack, a triple homicide, as you identified, by gunfire. And within the afternoon, actually, to SLED's credit, within the afternoon, they confirmed that they were requested to appear at the scene, but that it is not their investigation. And within the evening, we had a vehicle of interest, a Cadillac CTS that was purportedly recorded in that area at the time of the homicide. And this is where it gets a little interesting, because that Cadillac, I believe it was Sunday, was discovered over on Clover Hill Road. Now, that was provided to us by anonymous sources, the same people who identified the victims long before law enforcement did, so we can give them some credibility.
Absolutely.
Now, over on Clover Hill Road, we have some interesting happenings over there. Back in February, we had a drive-by shooting that led to a failed car chase, flipped out of control. I have been told that the area where this Cadillac was uncovered is ran by a gang, the Sand Hill Boys, singular Hill. So whether or not there's any affiliation, I'm just throwing that out there as an anecdotal note that a Cadillac that was a vehicle of interest is located in an area that is jurisdiction of the Sand Hill Boys, apropos of nothing. Now,
gang activity rampant in Walterboro. The Cowboys are obviously infamous for running Walterboro, but you reported also the body of an apparent alleged potential snitch was found decomposing in a suitcase in an abandoned.
Yeah, not too far from this incident here. Yeah. And yes, that woman was subsequently identified. I don't know what the status is on Walterboro PD's investigation. In fact, for those interested, going to refer back to the old reports, you see that there were some conflicting narratives coming out of the police department between higher-ups and higher-ups, giving one outlet something completely different than the other outlet. And if I catch you doing something contradictory, I will, of course, write about it, because that's concerning when you're pushing out two completely different narratives. But I suppose we haven't sat down to talk about that case. That being said, I don't know of anybody with updates on the woman that was found in a suitcase, in a truck, in a barn.
Yeah. So, Andy, obviously Walterboro is the site of a lot of these happenings. Mm-hmm. Of interest, we have also found out some news this week as it relates to the clerk of court in Colleton County. Actually, now she's the former clerk of court, but everyone remembers Miss Becky Hill, resigned her office earlier this year in the aftermath of allegations, all manner of allegations, regarding potentially misusing public funds in her office, potentially abusing her office to write her big book, which portions of which she's now admitted plagiarizing about the big Murdaugh trial. But Becky Hill, who has been the focus of multiple state ethics committee investigations, as well as a state law enforcement division investigation, a criminal and an ethics probe, those ethics charges have now, Andy, been referred for criminal prosecution to the Office of Attorney General Alan Wilson. But of course, this is where it gets really interesting. Anybody following this case knows that Becky Hill was the Attorney General's star witness in the hearing that kept Alec Murdaugh from getting a new trial. So they kind of had to work with her on that, but now they got to make a decision. Andy, do you think they should prosecute, or do you think they should farm this case out to a non-conflicted solicitor?
Well, you know me, I love my receipts. So, I mean, if the receipts are blatant and they're out there, then, I mean, by God, let's go to the South, put your war paint on. Yeah. And truly, this is my first time hearing this, so this is a true reaction. How exciting. Yeah. But it does raise a concern for me of a conflict of interest, considering those ties that you just mentioned. So, hell, I mean, this is untreaded water. What would the state do? I mean, what would you recommend the state do in a situation like this?
Well, it's a tough call. FITSNews was obviously very outspoken in calling out those conflicts of interest in the run-up to the Murdaugh evidentiary hearing, but we are told by our sources that Attorney General Alan Wilson will, quote, do the right thing. So we'll have to see what the right thing is. In my view, you ask me, I think he should hand it off to another solicitor. I suspect that's probably what the AG will do, but we'll have to see.
If you sense that I'm skeptical, it's because I am. I have completely lost faith in agencies policing themselves.
Yeah, well, that's why we hold them accountable, man. Mm-hmm. That's why we hold them accountable. By the way, be on the lookout this coming week for some big news from Andy Fancher when it comes to holding law enforcement accountable. But for now, Andy, excellent work on these cases. Thank you so much for following up on them. And folks, anyone with any information on any of these cases, please let us know. You can get in touch with Andy directly. Email him at andy@fitsnews.com. Submit stuff through our tip line. We want to find the truth and get justice for the victims of these cases. So for those of you who are new to FITSNews, you probably don't know that before all the Murdaugh saga, before all the other big stories we've broken, I was a reality television star. A That's right. I appeared on the very first episode of the very first season of a show called Southern Charm on Bravo. Now, obviously, I was way too sexy for the show. I was obviously too sexy for the show, and producers didn't know how to deal with that, so they had to cut me out of the rest of it. But before I left, I was responsible for connecting the two lead protagonists of this show. We're talking about Thomas Ravenel, the former state treasurer, and his former love interest and the mother of two of his children, Katherine Calhoun Dennis, the descendant of two of the most famous political families in South Carolina, former Vice President John C. Calhoun and former Senate President Rembert C. Dennis. Now, these are huge names in Palmetto politics and the history of the Palmetto State. But Dennis made a name for herself on Southern Charm. After a few appearances in the first season, she became a full-time cast member in the second season of Southern Charm and quickly grew a huge social media following given her starring role on this show. But things haven't gone as well for Dennis off the camera. There was a bruising custody battle, a multi-year custody battle with Ravenel over their two children, which she eventually lost a few years back. And since then, things have been incredibly difficult on the statuesque redheaded diva from Moncks Corner, South Carolina. Now, Kathryn, as you recall, was linked, but not charged, linked to an incident last fall involving a hit and run involving an officer outside of an elementary school down there in the Low Country in Berkeley County. This was an incident in which a Ford Bronco, which was registered to Dennis, struck an officer on the hand while she was directing traffic outside the elementary school. Now, this case remains open. No charges have been filed. Again, no idea what exactly is happening with that case, but we do know that this past week, Dennis was arrested, first offense, driving under the influence by police officers in Goose Creek, South Carolina. This was following a collision in which Dennis is alleged to have rear-ended another vehicle, which apparently then crashed into yet another car. But a few folks were injured in that accident, but Dennis was administered a field sobriety test, which she did not pass, subsequently placed under arrest for not only driving under the influence, but for open container. There was apparently a few open mini bottles of Fireball in the car. So again, it's another setback for Katherine Dennis, who again appears to have struggled a bit in the aftermath of Southern Charm. Now, not everything's going terribly for Katherine Dennis. She recently re-enrolled at the University of South Carolina and had in fact spoken with this media outlet about sitting down for an interview about her future plans. In fact, some of those plans, according to her, could involve future in politics. She talked about some of the things that made her passionate when she was a student at the University of South Carolina back over a decade ago, before Southern Charm. But obviously this latest arrest, another speed bump in those plans. But kind of this news outlet, which has always enjoyed a friendly relationship with Katherine Dennis. We obviously got her on that show, Southern Charm, over a decade ago, but counting us to continue to report on the latest, not only as it relates to this DUI charge, but more importantly, that hit and run investigation that was linked to her vehicle last fall. If there are charges in that case, counting us to update you on them. But more importantly, in the event that we can get Katherine to sit down and talk about all these things, to talk about life after Southern Charm, and to talk about hopefully turning her future around, we would certainly welcome the opportunity to sit down with Katherine Dennis. But again, we're not really a reality television covering media outlet here. We don't always follow the ins and outs of those shows, but Southern Charm, based in Charleston, South Carolina, has been an exception. In fact, if you go back over a decade ago, we were the first outlet to report that this show would be launching in Charleston, and we followed it very closely over the past decade. But again, keep it tuned to FITSNews for the very latest as we follow the Katherine Dennis saga. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and thank everyone who supports us with those subscriptions. They help enable everything we do. But be on the lookout this coming week. It's the last weekend of the month, so you know what that means. It's the Month in Review, where we go live to take your questions on all the big stories that we've been covering. And I fully expect that this Month in Review is going to focus extensively on this Mica Miller case, because there's just so much interest, so many questions. But be on the lookout this coming week for the form where we submit it. If you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, do that right now so you can get that form and submit your questions for next week's Month in Review. It'll be live Friday at 11 a.m. this coming Friday here on FITSNews. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll catch you next week for the Month in Review.